So ready? For what purposes does the gentleman from Massachusetts rise?
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the Committee on Rules, I call up House Resolution 655 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will read the report. The clerk will report the resolution.
House Calendar Number 50, House Resolution 655. Resolved that upon adoption of this resolution, it shall be in order without intervention of any point of order to consider in the House the resolution, House Resolution 296, affirming the United States record on the Armenian Genocide. The resolution shall be considered as read. The previous question shall be considered as ordered on the resolution and preamble to adoption without intervening motion or demand for division of the question except 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized for 1 hour.
Mr. Speaker, for the purposes of debate only, I yield the customary 30 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Burgess, pending which I yield myself such time as I consume. During consideration of this resolution, all time yielded is for the purposes of debate only, and I ask unanimous consent that all members be given 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the Rules Committee met and reported a rule, House Resolution 655, providing for consideration of H.Res.296 under a closed rule. This resolution also provides 1 hour of general debate controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, this rule is about U.S. leadership, standing for human rights, and whether we're going to turn a blind eye to atrocities, even if they took place 100 years ago. H.Res.296 is a resolution formally recognizing and memorializing the Armenian genocide. And let me say, it is about time. 1.5 million Armenians died at the hands of the Ottoman Empire and the emerging nation of Turkey over a century ago. Tens of thousands of Armenians were violently expelled from their ancestral homelands. These truths are important. Acknowledging them is important. Yet the United States has only tinkered around the edges of recognizing this reality. Some of our nation's closest allies already have. 31 nations, in fact, countries like Canada, Italy, France, Poland, Sweden, and Germany. Even Russia has recognized the genocide. Mr. Speaker, here is a map of those nations, and you can tell that the United States stands out, and I say that with great sadness. White House statements and congressional resolutions over the years have referred to mass atrocities and other euphemisms, but nothing in recent times has fully recognized it by calling it what it actually was, a genocide. And we need to speak the truth, Mr. Speaker. 49 of our 50 states have formally recognized the Armenian genocide, but the federal government has not. This is a dark stain on our human rights record. The United States should stand foursquare for human rights. Anything short of that sends exactly the wrong message to abusers around the globe. Mr. Speaker, I represent a congressional district in central Massachusetts. It is the home to the oldest Armenian community in America. The first Armenian Orthodox Church in America was built in Worcester, Massachusetts, my hometown. People still worship in it today. When I was first elected in 1996, we had rows and rows of pews filled with survivors of the Armenian genocide, sitting at the front of the church during our annual remembrance of the Armenian genocide. Sadly, almost 2 years ago, the last of our survivors, Rose, passed away. I've learned so much from this community. And to those who insist that now is not the time for us to recognize the Armenian genocide, I have to ask in return, when will it be the right time? When the last survivor of the genocide has passed away? Those who want the world to forget, those who want to deny genocide, they believe that history will be erased with the last eyewitness to genocide. I must be honest, Mr. Speaker, as many political leaders have proclaimed never again over the years, the Armenian American community has been left to wonder when never again would finally become enough is enough. With this resolution, the United States will join the ranks of the many nations, parliaments, and institutions that have fully recognized and commemorated the Armenian Genocide. We will speak out clearly in favor of human rights. And finally, we will say loud and clear that enough is enough. Mr. Speaker, as we acknowledge this genocide from 100 years ago, I'm glad this House is separately considering H.R. 4695 on suspension this week. And this bill recognizes the blood that is being spilled today in northern Syria. Because of Turkey's ruthless aggression, hundreds of civilians have been killed. Thousands more have been displaced. Erdogan's government has targeted the Kurds, one of our strongest and most courageous allies in the fight against ISIS. What is going on there can only be described as ethnic cleansing. Instead of standing up for the people who have fought alongside U.S. troops in Syria, President Trump gave Turkey the green light to try and wipe the Kurds off the map. The President even complimented President Erdogan, calling him a friend, a tough man, a hell of a leader. And just last week, 9 days after the President first announced sanctions against Turkey, he unilaterally lifted all the sanctions against Turkey. 9 days. Are you kidding me? Never in my life did I think I would see the day when a President of the United States would pave the way for a nation to systematically slaughter our allies. Remove sanctions from a country engaging in ethnic cleansing without holding anyone to account. Or put U.S. troops stationed abroad in harm's way, all while giving Russia not only a PR victory, but control over territory that just days before had been safe, secure, and free from the control of ISIS terrorists and Assad's murderous regime. So standing up for human rights is not a Democratic or Republican issue. It's an American issue. And even in an age of heightened partisanship, this Congress must still be capable of speaking with one voice against genocide and crimes against humanity, no matter when they took place. And so I urge all of my colleagues to support this rule and the underlying resolution so we can show the world that we still are. And with that, I reserve my time.
The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank Mr. McGovern for yielding me the customary 30 minutes, and I yield to myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, today we consider a resolution to once again assert the position of the House of Representatives with respect to the Armenian genocide that occurred between 1915 and 1923. This resolution cites previous United States recognition of the killing of Armenians, including in 1951, 1975, 1981, and 1984. Numerous resolutions have been introduced in the House and Senate that did not pass both chambers. In addition, Congress has twice designated April 24th as a National Day of Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man, specifically referencing Armenia. The United States has clearly indicated its support of the Armenians. While there is historic precedent for recognizing the Armenian genocide, passing such a resolution today could complicate the situation with a NATO ally. And previously, this has resulted in protests at and around the Incirlik Air Base that have affected our men and women in uniform who were stationed there. While the desire to recognize the Armenian genocide is laudable, these events took place over 100 years ago. It remains unclear why we are urgently considering this resolution. The Committee on Foreign Affairs did not conduct a hearing or hold a markup before we voted last night in the Rules Committee to bring this to the floor today. Representative Schiff introduced this resolution on April 8th of this year, 2019, so we are left to wonder why we wait until there are 11 legislative days until expiration of the continuing resolution to fund the entirety of the government of the United States on the discretionary side, why we are willing to suspend that to consider a non-binding resolution. Democrats continue to bring to the floor legislation that is either not urgent or has no chance of passing the Senate and becoming law. There are bipartisan policy areas in which Republicans stand ready to work with Democrats for the benefit of the American people. The most pressing issue, of course, is the continuing resolution expiration. While the House did pass 10 of the 12 appropriations bills, they were constructed largely without Republican input on the Appropriations Committee, resulting in highly partisan provisions that actually prevented any Republicans from being able to support these bills when they came to the floor. One of the most important appropriations bills, providing funding for the Department of Homeland Security, has not received consideration by the full House. We are facing a humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border. That is real. That is right now. This situation got so bad in the early summer that Congress had to pass a supplemental appropriation bill to last year's appropriation just to provide the basic necessities for those in the Customs and Border Protection custody. While this temporary funding influx helped alleviate the number of people in our border facilities and the Office of Refugee Resettlement Shelters, it did not make any policy changes which would actually address the root cause of this crisis. If Democrats are unwilling to provide funding to secure our border, we should consider disincentivizing people from making the dangerous journey in the first place. There are people who die along the way. Others are seriously injured or become ill, and still the others become victims of human trafficking. Additionally, the cartels are profiting big time off these vulnerable individuals, taking a cut from 2/3 of southern border flows. The penalty for not paying off the cartel is death. Rather than incentivize this type of activity, could we not focus our efforts on combating the drivers of irregular migration from El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras? We could also send a message that if you come to the United States without legal documentation, you will not be permitted to remain here indefinitely. To change this, Congress could pass a bill to reform our asylum laws and provide more resources to clear the backlog of immigration cases, a backlog that is approaching 1 million cases. Another area where Congress could be spending our valuable time is discussing solutions for the cost of prescriptions of pharmaceuticals. There is bipartisan consensus that we could cap out-of-pocket costs for our seniors in Medicare Part D. This is a policy that we can and should draft together. In fact, we had a bipartisan Energy and Commerce and Ways and Means request for information on the topic of restructuring Part D last May. If we work together in a thoughtful, bipartisan, bicameral manner on restructuring the Part D benefit, the President would sign that legislation. And he has even said that is a top priority. And our constituents would see lower out-of-pocket drug costs. But what do we get? We get H.R. 3, Speaker Pelosi's partisan drug pricing bill, which sidelines achievable drug pricing policies that were in the works prior to the release of H.R. 3. Additionally, last week marked the 1-year anniversary of President Trump signing the SUPPORT Act into law. This legislation provides realistic solutions that span the breadth of the opiate crisis, from prevention and treatment to education and enforcement. This legislation will improve treatment for those with substance use disorders, fight deadly fentanyl, bolster the efforts of our agents at the international mail facilities, and provide vital resources for new and innovative alternatives for the treatment of pain. In a time when our country seems so divided, Congress was able to put political differences aside and put patients first to find solutions to address this crisis. As it stands now, the SUPPORT Act is another tool in the toolbox for communities and federal agencies to successfully combat the opioid epidemic. We could be having discussions on how to build on that success and ensure timely and effective implementation of the SUPPORT Act so we could continue to help those affected by the more than 130 American overdose deaths each and every day. Instead, we're spending our time considering a non-urgent, non-binding resolution. American consumers are concerned about their online privacy. The passage of California's Consumer Privacy Act has led to a patchwork of state privacy laws that do not reflect the reality that the internet doesn't know state lines. We need one national standard, perhaps consider federal preemption, and promote a cross-border data flow as American businesses seek to do business at home and abroad. You could even argue that e-commerce is the reason that the founders drafted the Commerce Clause in the first place. Again, Republicans stand ready to work with Democrats, but we've not been invited to engage in any substantive discussions. Congress could also pass, and in fact must pass, the United States, Canada, and Mexico Agreement on Trade, the USMCA. This was negotiated to replace the North American Free Trade Agreement. This agreement is possibly the most impactful policy that Congress could pass this year. The administration has negotiated with Canada and Mexico over the past 2 years to produce the best trade deal possible. The USMCA increases market access for American exports, it levels the playing field for the American worker, and brings important intellectual property protections into the 21st century. Millions of jobs and billions of dollars worth of trade are waiting on the passage of this bill. If Speaker Pelosi brought the USMCA to the floor today, it would pass before the week's out. Unfortunately, the Democratic majority is slow-walking this USMCA and doing harm to our nation's farmers, workers, and small businesses. There is no reason to continue to delay a vote on this agreement. In addition, securing the USMCA would give the United States additional authority with the ongoing negotiations with China. Providing full appropriations for the federal government, addressing the humanitarian and security crisis at our southern border, working to lower prescription drug prices and provide continued support to combat the opiate epidemic, negotiating a strong federal privacy law, and passing the USMCA are all urgent policy priorities that could receive bipartisan support. And yet, we are delaying action on these necessary measures to consider a non-urgent, non-binding resolution that simply reaffirms what has remained clear United States policy regarding Armenia. I hope my fellow Democrats on the Rules Committee and in the House of Representatives will soon prioritize legislation that will help the American people. With that, I urge opposition to the rule and reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, my colleague from Texas talked about a lot of different subjects in his opening remarks. But I have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed. Well, more than a little bit. I'm disappointed and somewhat offended at the implication that this is not an important matter. Let me remind him that 1.5 million Armenians died at the hands of the Ottoman Empire and the emerging nation of Turkey. Let me remind him of the countless hundreds of thousands of people who had to flee because of that oppression. And let me also remind him that it is not the official policy of the United States government. If it were, that map I showed you would have included us as a nation formally recognizing the Armenian genocide. So my friend may not think it is important, but as somebody who cares deeply about human rights, it is important that we respect historical accuracy and that we respect the truth. And I don't know if the gentleman was in the Rules Committee last night when our colleague from California, Anna Eshoo, movingly and tearfully talked about her family's experiences during that time, where she lost ancestors, and her parents, came to the United States to try to have a better life. But I mean, I don't know how we can just kind of brush this off as like, this is not a big deal. It is a big deal. It's a big deal to the Armenian Americans, and it is a big deal to anybody who cares about human rights in this country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Florida, a distinguished member of the Rules Committee, Ms. Shalala.
The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. McGovern. Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the resolution affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide. This resolution is long overdue. 1.5 million Armenians and thousands of Maronites, Chaldeans, Melkites, Assyrians, and others who were part of the Ottoman Empire. Mr. Speaker, my grandparents left the Ottoman Empire to escape that genocide just ahead, but their relatives were not as lucky. My grandparents were Maronites. I remember my grandmother's tears as she spoke of their Armenian friends and the many Maronites and Melkites that were slaughtered by the Ottoman Empire. As a child, I remember the tears and the suffering of our Armenian neighbors and the many members of the other communities whose tears I could not erase. As a child, I could not erase those tears, but for them, I proudly support this resolution. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I'll reserve at this time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
To the gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who has been a leader on this issue for many years.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
After decades of struggle, this House will recognize the Armenian genocide just in time for it to be seen by the last few survivors of the first genocide of the 20th century. We should have recognized that genocide again and again long ago, but we didn't because we were told that we had a great alliance with Turkey. Earlier this month, Turkish forces shelled near and deliberately bracketed American bases. Americans fled in unseemly haste. Great ally. It has been a great alliance for Turkey. We defended them from communism in the 40s, defended them for the Soviet Union for decades, and provided them with $23 billion in aid. It is critical that we counteract Turkey's genocide denial, because genocide denial is the last act of a genocide. First, you obliterate a people, then you seek to obliterate their memory, and finally, you seek to obliterate the memory of the obliteration. And because genocide denial is also the first step in the next genocide. When Hitler's cadres wondered if they could get away with the Holocaust, he was able to assure them, who today speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians. And we must recognize this genocide to remove the stain on America's honor, because up until now, we have refused to acknowledge truth, and we have been silent, all in an effort at appeasement. The fact is that many other countries have recognized the genocide, including Belgium, Canada, Greece, Italy, Argentina, and Germany. And when France had the courage to pass a genocide recognition resolution, they were threatened with a boycott of all their exports. In fact, what happened was a four-fold increase in French exports to Turkey. The only thing worse than unnecessary appeasement is appeasing a power that will not actually respond. Today, Germany is a great and prosperous democracy, a great ally of the United States. Where would Germany be if to this day they denied the Holocaust? Turkey will be a great ally of the United States and a prosperous and modern nation only when Turkey recognizes the first genocide of the 20th century. I commend the gentleman for bringing up this rule and for answering the question why this is so important to do this today, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized. Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I've just returned from Armenia, where I went to the Armenian Genocide Museum. I cannot get the pictures that I saw out of my mind. Armenian women and children murdered in mass graves, Armenian leaders hung as examples to others, Armenians forced onto long death marches without food or water. There were 1.5 million Armenians killed in this genocide in 1915. I saw the documents of the many who had witnessed it, including U.S. diplomat Henry Morgenthau, and yet, over 100 years later, the U.S. has never officially acknowledged it. This vote to finally acknowledge the Armenian genocide should have come sooner because of people in my district like Joseph Bipo Manjikian. When I met him, he was 104, but from his wheelchair, he told me about the many family members he lost in the genocide. Bipo passed away before he could see this day. He didn't forget them, and neither can we. For the sake of Bipo and so many others, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this resolution.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I'll reserve.
The gentleman from Texas reserved. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Armenian Issues, Mr. Pallone.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, my colleague from New Jersey, and thank you, Mr. McGovern, for bringing this rule up today. And I rise in support of the rule to bring up the Armenian genocide resolution. As Judy Chu said, and I just came back from Armenia at the same time, we were at the Genocide Memorial in Yerevan, and I was actually there a few years ago on the 100th anniversary of the genocide with our two Armenian members of Congress, Anna Eshu and Jackie Spear. And I have to say it was unfortunate for us. We were proud to be here for the 100th commemoration, but we still were very upset over the fact that the United States had not recognized the Armenian genocide in recent years. And of course, this has been a goal of the Armenia caucus and the Armenian diaspora for over 30 years that this day, this historic day, would finally occur. And I want to thank the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, who has made this day possible. This resolution is important. It commemorates the victims of the Armenian genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Turks over 104 years after it took place. For too long, Congress has failed to recognize the indisputable fact that the Ottoman Turks perpetrated the first genocide of the 20th century. This crime against humanity would serve as the blueprint for other genocides in the Nazi concentration camps and massacres in Poland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, and more recently in Bosnia and Rwanda. Today, we'll finally acknowledge what historians have documented with clear evidence, that the Turkish campaign of slaughter and forced displacement of millions of Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and other religious minorities was, in fact, a genocide. The passage of this resolution is an important step in raising awareness and showing the world that we have a commitment to human rights and the dignity of every human life. In the words of George Santayana, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We stand today to show that the House of Representatives will not be complicit in covering up past atrocities in the 20th century, nor turn our back when ethnic or religious minorities are threatened in the 21st century. We must also urge Turkey to come to terms with its own history and look beyond the thinly veiled facade of denial that covered up one of the most horrific crimes in world history. We must urge Turkey to join the rest of the world in recognizing the sanctity of human life, even if it's someone that doesn't look like you, speaks a different language, or attends a different house of worship. Turkey has a long history of repressing ethnic minorities, including the Kurds, who they are killing as we speak. And it doesn't matter whether they're Christians or Muslims. Many of the Kurds are their Muslim brethren. I'm also a strong supporter of the bipartisan Turkey sanctions bill that will also be considered this week. It is unfortunate that it took the abandonment of our allies in northern Syria to get to this point. But I'm pleased to see that we are working across the aisle to finally push back against the bully that is President Erdogan. We cannot trust the Turkish, Russian, or Syrian governments to uphold peace and protect innocent lives in the region. We must stand up to authoritarian leaders like Erdogan, Putin, and Assad to defend our regional partners and innocent lives. And again, I want to thank the chairman. I want to thank Chairman Schiff, the sponsor of this resolution, Chairman Engel, the House leadership, and other members of the Congressional Caucus for their support of strong American leadership and for the work to finally get this passed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, if we defeat the previous question, Republicans will amend the rule to suspend the ongoing impeachment inquiry until we achieve operational control of our southern border. As I previously stated, we are experiencing a humanitarian and security crisis on the southern border. In August, Customs and Border Protection apprehended over 64,000 individuals who lacked legal documentation to enter this country. Apprehensions are on a track to reach over 1 million individuals attempting to cross into the United States along our southern border this fiscal year. The House should prioritize securing our southern border and stemming the flow of irregular migration over a politically motivated impeachment inquiry. Until operation of the border control is achieved, the House should suspend the impeachment inquiry. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert the text of my amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection.
And I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I have to say to the gentleman from Texas that, again, it is frustrating to hear his comments. I mean, we're talking about a resolution recognizing the Armenian genocide. 1.5 million people were murdered. And I think it's generally a bipartisan resolution. I want to commend, not only Chairman Engel and Chairman Smith, who's a Republican, for their testimony before the Rules Committee. I want to thank Congressman Schiff, who's the main author of this, but our colleague on the Rules Committee, Congresswoman Lesko, came out very strongly in favor of this resolution. But if there's ever kind of it'd be nice if there were a couple of moments here that didn't always have to be politicized. And I think this resolution, it should be one of those moments. This is important. This is serious. And we shouldn't bring politics into a resolution dealing with the recognition of a genocide. So I obviously have a different opinion on how people should vote on the previous question. But having said that, I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Sanchez.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in strong support of this resolution to recognize the Armenian genocide. This tragedy is one of the most painful moments in our world's history. We owe it to the more than 2 million victims and their descendants never to forget. It is heartbreaking that some choose to deny our past rather than to learn from this painful moment in history. It's an insult to millions who died and the millions who risked their lives to escape violence. Denial is all too easy. It's harder to face the truth, and facing the truth is the right thing to do. When we rewrite the darkest chapters of our history, we open the door to them happening again. The United States cannot be complicit in that denial. I urge my colleagues to send a resounding message to the world that we stand with the Armenian community. We will not forget. We will not obscure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yeah, let me yield myself a minute. Mr. Speaker, I would just point out that this Congress has acted on this in the past. House Joint Resolution 148, passed in the 94th Congress, a joint resolution to designate April 24th, 1975 as a National Day of Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man, passed the House April 8th, 1975. And then again, a joint resolution 247 from the 98th Congress, a joint resolution to designate April 24th as a National Day of Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man, passed the House 10 September 1984. I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Again, it really is frustrating to hear my colleague try to dismiss this. There has not been a resolution calling this a genocide and outlining all the facts before. And so I would again urge my colleagues in a bipartisan way to support the underlying bill, to reject any attempts to try to politicize this process. And again, I think it is, we do this out of respect for those victims of the genocide, for the survivors, for the Armenian American community, for the Armenian community all over the world. And we do it because the United States of America is supposed to be committed to a very high standard of human rights. I mean, if we stand for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. To not appropriately acknowledge a genocide only paves the way for future thugs and dictators and authoritarians to commit similar atrocities, believing that somehow the United States, the most powerful country in the world, will just look the other way. I hope that we have a strong bipartisan support on this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy, and I appreciated his words. You know, for years we've danced around this. It's complex with the Turks. They are, in terms of the relationship that we've tried to deal with. But denying the genocide has not helped resolve those issues. It hasn't changed the behavior of the Turks. Look at what's happening with the Kurds today. Failure to acknowledge this horrific episode is a burden for us all. Standing up for human rights, acknowledging the truth, giving a sense of closure and solace to the people who endured this horrific activity, and making sure that we are united in our opposition to those genocidal activities. And sadly, unless and until the Turks own their history, acknowledge, they're not going to be able to move past it. This is a chapter that needs more, a spotlight shown on it. I appreciate this formal acknowledgement by the House of Representatives. I think it's a first step towards healing, and it's an important step towards preventing tragedies like this in the future. I'm proud to support it and look forward to its passage on the floor of the House. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how many additional speakers the gentleman from Massachusetts has? Then I will yield myself the balance of our time. And I also do feel obligated to point out that the gentleman had said that he did not want to see this issue politicized. I would just simply note that this resolution could have been brought to the floor under suspension of the rules and likely passed with a large bipartisan majority under suspension of the rules. The difficulty that I have today is that we are spending the time on a rule bill for this bill that would have passed under suspension when we in fact have some pretty important things out there hanging over us. One of those things, of course, is funding the entire federal government so we don't end up in another government shutdown. And the other is to somehow resolve this question of impeachment that has bogged down this body for months, if not years. So, Mr. Speaker, as I previously outlined, there are other important time-sensitive priorities. Once again, we have 11 legislative days remaining before the continuing resolution expires. In place of a non-urgent, non-binding resolution, we could be finding a way to ensure that our government remains open and that Americans continue to receive federal benefits and services and paychecks on which they depend. I ask my fellow Democrats to prioritize the needs of the American people, and I will urge a no vote on the previous question, a no on the rule, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman wonders why we didn't bring this legislation up under suspension of the rules. To be honest with you, I think there was a concern by Democrats and Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee that we might not have all the votes that we needed to pass on the suspension of the rules. As you know, the government of Turkey employs very well-paid lobbyists here in Washington, and they have been working quite diligently trying to defeat this. So I hope we have a vote that is overwhelming, but we don't know. Secondly, I don't know why the gentleman would object to bringing this up under a rule. It gives more time for members on both sides of the aisle to be able to speak on this, and a lot of members do. We had a lot of Democrats on our side who wanted to speak. We have others who are going to speak when the underlying bill comes up. So I don't quite get it. And let me just, again, say for the record, this is not the official policy of the United States. If it was, President Trump would publicly acknowledge the Armenian genocide. And by the way, I'm not picking on President Trump. I mean, the same could be said for President Obama. I go right down the list of presidents. So the deal is, this is not the official policy. If it was, we wouldn't be here. And it really is somewhat disappointing that the gentleman doesn't quite appreciate how impactful this is and how important this is. You know, Mr. Speaker, the horrors of human rights abuses can be mind-numbing, whether they occurred 100 years ago, like the Armenian genocide, or are happening today in Syria at the hands of Erdogan's government. I get it. It's easier to turn away than to see the impact of brutality, the loss of life, the maiming of civilians, including children, and the devastated communities. It can turn your stomach and break your heart, but we must not lose our capacity for outrage. That 1.5 million Armenians died at the hands of the Ottoman Empire and the emerging nation of Turkey should outrage all of us. Formally recognizing this genocide is the right thing to do. I wish we took this step long ago, but it is always the right time to do the right thing. So I urge my colleagues, let's speak with one voice. Let's join some of our closest allies in recognizing the Armenian genocide. And let's finally remove this dark stain on the record of the United States of America. I may say this all the time, but, you know, we are, at the core of our being as a nation should be upholding a high standard of human rights. We should always be counted on to speak out when people's human rights are being denied. And we certainly should be counted on to adhere to historical accuracy. This happened, and it is time that it become the official policy of the United States of America to recognize that it did happen and call it for what it was. It was a genocide. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the previous question, vote yes on the rule, and vote yes on the underlying bill. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9, Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question on the House Resolution 655 will be followed by 5-minute votes on adoption of the House Resolution 655 if ordered. Ordering the previous question on the House Resolution 656 and adoption of House Resolution 656 if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.
The first set of roll call votes of the day here in the House. Members have been considering a bill affirming the U.S. record on the Armenian genocide. This is a vote on a procedural motion related to that bill. And then members have been also working on a couple of public lands bills, and so we'll see votes on those too. So a 15-minute vote here on the procedural motion on the Armenian genocide bill, and then public lands bills. Those will all be 5 minutes.
Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man passed the House April 8, 1975. And then again, a joint resolution 247 from the 98th Congress, a joint resolution to designate April 24th as a National Day of Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man passed the House 10 September 1984. I'll reserve my time.
Gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Again, it really is frustrating to hear my colleague try to dismiss this. There has not been a resolution calling this a genocide and outlining all the facts before. And so I would again urge my colleagues in a bipartisan way to support the underlying bill, to reject any attempts to try to politicize this process. And again, I think it is, we do this out of respect for those victims of the genocide, for the survivors, for the Armenian American community, for the Armenian community all over the world. And we do it because the United States of America is supposed to be committed to a very high standard of human rights. I mean, if we stand for anything, we need to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. To not appropriately acknowledge a genocide only paves the way for future thugs and dictators and authoritarians to commit similar atrocities, believing that somehow the United States, the most powerful country in the world, will just look the other way. I hope that we have a strong bipartisan support on this resolution. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. Blumenauer.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I appreciate the gentleman's courtesy, and I appreciated his words. You know, for years, we've danced around this. It's complex with the Turks. They are, in terms of the relationship that we've tried to deal with. But denying the genocide has not helped resolve those issues. It hasn't changed the behavior of the Turks. Look at what's happening with the Kurds today. Failure to acknowledge this horrific episode is a burden for us all. Standing up for human rights, acknowledging the truth, giving a sense of closure and solace to the people who endured this horrific activity, and making sure that we are united in our opposition to those genocidal activities. And sadly, unless and until the Turks own their history, acknowledge, they're not going to be able to move past it. This is a chapter that needs more spotlight shown on it. I appreciate this formal acknowledgement by the House of Representatives. I think it's a first step towards healing, and it's an important step towards preventing tragedies like this in the future. I'm proud to support it and look forward to its passage on the floor of the House. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire how many additional speakers the gentleman from Massachusetts has? Then I will yield myself the balance of our time. And I also do feel obligated to point out that the gentleman had said that he did not want to see this issue politicized. I would just simply note that this resolution could have been brought to the floor under suspension of the rules and likely passed with a large bipartisan majority under suspension of the rules. The difficulty that I have today is that we are spending the time on a rule bill for this bill that would have passed under suspension when we in fact have some pretty important things out there hanging over us. One of those things, of course, is funding the entire federal government so we don't end up in another government shutdown. And the other is to somehow resolve this question of impeachment that has bogged down this body for months, if not years. So Mr. Speaker, as I previously outlined, there are other important time-sensitive priorities. Once again, we have 11 legislative days remaining before the continuing resolution expires. In place of a non-urgent, non-binding resolution, we could be finding a way to ensure that our government remains open and that Americans continue to receive federal benefits and services and paychecks on which they depend. I ask my fellow Democrats to prioritize the needs of the American people, and I will urge a no vote on the previous question, a no on the rule, and I'll yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman wonders why we didn't bring this legislation up under suspension of the rules. To be honest with you, I think there was a concern by Democrats and Republicans on the Foreign Affairs Committee that we might not have all the votes that we needed to pass under suspension of the rules. As you know, the government of Turkey employs very well-paid lobbyists here in Washington, and they have been working quite diligently trying to defeat this. So I hope we have a vote that is overwhelming, but we don't know. Secondly, I don't know why the gentleman would object to bringing this up under a rule. It gives more time for members on both sides of the aisle to be able to speak on this, and a lot of members do. We had a lot of Democrats on our side who wanted to speak. We have others who are going to speak when the underlying bill comes up. So I don't quite get it. And let me just, again, say for the record, this is not the official policy of the United States. If it was, President Trump would publicly acknowledge the Armenian genocide. And by the way, I'm not picking on President Trump. I mean, the same could be said for President Obama. I go right down the list of presidents. So the deal is, this is not the official policy. If it was, we wouldn't be here. And it really is somewhat disappointing that the gentleman doesn't quite appreciate how impactful this is and how important this is. You know, Mr. Speaker, the horrors of human rights abuses can be mind-numbing, whether they occurred 100 years ago, like the Armenian genocide, or are happening today in Syria at the hands of Erdogan's government. I get it. It's easier to turn away than to see the impact of brutality, the loss of life, the maiming of civilians, including children, and the devastated communities. It can turn your stomach and break your heart, but we must not lose our capacity for outrage. That 1.5 million Armenians died at the hands of the Ottoman Empire and the emerging nation of Turkey should outrage all of us. Formally recognizing this genocide is the right thing to do. I wish we took this step long ago, but it is always the right time to do the right thing. So I urge my colleagues, let's speak with one voice. Let's join some of our closest allies in recognizing the Armenian genocide. And let's finally remove this dark stain on the record of the United States of America. I may say this all the time, but, you know, we are, at the core of our being as a nation, should be upholding a high standard of human rights. We should always be counted on to speak out when people's human rights are being denied. And we certainly should be counted on to adhere to historical accuracy. This happened, and it is time that it become the official policy of the United States of America to recognize that it did happen and call it for what it was. It was a genocide. So, Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the previous question, vote yes on the rule, and vote yes on the underlying bill. I yield back the balance of my time, and I move the previous question on the resolution.
The previous question, the question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. Sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, This 15-minute vote on ordering the previous question on the House Resolution 655 will be followed by 5-minute votes on adoption of the House Resolution 655 if ordered, ordering the previous question on the House Resolution 656 and adoption of House Resolution 656 if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 655, I call up House Resolution 296, affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide, and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 296, resolution affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 655, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking member of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, each will control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on House Resolution 296.
Without objection,
I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the resolution before us is an important measure to set the record straight on the atrocities suffered by the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century. We know what happened in this dark period of history. Between 1915 and 1923, 1.5 million Armenians were murdered. This was a genocide, and it's important that we call this crime what it was. Many American politicians, diplomats, and institutions have rightly recognized these atrocities as a genocide, including America's ambassador to the Ottoman Empire at the time, Henry Morgenthau, and later President Ronald Reagan. It's time that we set the record straight. Only by shining a light on the darkest parts of our history can we learn to not repeat them. And properly acknowledging what has occurred is a necessary step in achieving some measure of justice for the victims. House Resolution 296 sticks to the historical facts. It is a good common-sense measure with broad bipartisan support. I want to thank Mr. Schiff, the resolution's author, as well as Ms. Eshu, Ms. Spear, Ms. Shalala, Mr. McGovern, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Bilirakis, Mr. Smith, and the many other bipartisan champions of this issue for their persistent, steadfast pursuit of recognition for the suffering the Armenian people endured. I strongly support this measure and urge all my colleagues to do the same. With its passage, we put Congress on the right side of history, properly acknowledging and condemning this horrific genocide. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, when the term genocide was created in 1944 to describe the systematic destruction of an entire people, its author, Raphael Lemkin, explained the term by saying, quote, "It's the sort of thing Hitler did to the Jews and the Turks did to the Armenians." When he ordered the invasion of Poland in 1939, Adolf Hitler said, quote, "Who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians," close quote. Mr. Speaker, in the year 2000 and again in the year 2015, I chaired 2 congressional hearings on the Armenian genocide. In 2000, the House was moving to pass a bipartisan resolution by Congressman Radonovich and Bonner, H.Res.296. After hearing fact-based, eloquent testimonies from Congressman James Rogan and David Bonner, followed by the State Department, history professors, and then witnesses from both the Armenian and the Turkish side, my subcommittee successfully marked up H.Res.296 for consideration by the full committee. Ambassador Mark Grossman, however, testified at the hearing that President Bill Clinton was against the Armenian genocide resolution. That opposition proved to be very significant, and as we were moving with the highest expectations towards passage, President Clinton's National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, took the extraordinary step of admonishing Speaker Hastert not to bring it to the floor, and he caved. The resolution never even got a vote. In 2007, Chairman Tom Lantos, like Chairman Henry Hyde before him, reported the resolution out of committee, sponsored by Congressman Schiff and Radonovich, although it never got out of the committee in 2000, but he wanted to. And that was H.Res.106. That, too, never made it to the floor. That, Mr. Speaker, changes today. The affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide, H.Res.296, is a sense of Congress resolution that commemorates the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance. The resolution wisely notes that the United States has officially recognized the Armenian genocide through the U.S. government's May 1951 written statement to the International Court of Justice regarding the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, through President Ronald Reagan's proclamation number 4838 on April 22, 1981, and by House Joint Resolution 148, adopted in 1975, and House Joint Resolution 247, adopted in September of 1984. The resolution also points out that the U.S. played a major role, the role, in the humanitarian relief efforts. And of course, the Near East Relief Agency saved tens of thousands of Armenians and others. As a matter of fact, the historian Howard Sakar noted it quite literally kept an entire nation alive, and that's reflected in the resolution. Yet today, the Armenian genocide is the only genocide of the 20th century where survivors, family, and all those who care about this important issue have been subjected to the ongoing outrage of a massive, well-funded, aggressive campaign of genocide denial, openly sustained and lavishly funded by the state by the state authority, in this case, the government of Turkey. And the Turkish government underwrites a disgraceful disinformation campaign to confuse the historical record. It often employs lobbyists in this town to carry that message forward. My 2015 hearing, Mr. Speaker, marked the 100th year since the beginning of the genocide, and I appropriately entitled it "A Century of Denial, the Armenian Genocide and the Ongoing Quest for Justice." As Pope Francis said at his Mass marking the 100th year of genocide, concealing or denying evil is like allowing a wound to keep bleeding without bandaging it. The facts of the genocide were reported, Mr. Speaker, throughout the world as they were happening, corroborated immediately afterward by survivors and even some of the perpetrators, and have been amply documented by historians. And in one particular book that I've read by Ambassador Morgenthau, who was our U.S. ambassador contemporaneously at the time to the Ottoman Empire. In 1915, as we know, there were about 2 million Armenians living in what was then the Ottoman Empire, now Turkey. They were living in a region that they had inhabited for 2,500 years or more. By 1923, however, over 90% of these Armenians had disappeared. Most of them, an estimated 1.5 million, were slaughtered Most of them were death marched into the desert or shot, and many of the women were raped. The remainder, the remnant, was forced into exile. U.S. Ambassador Morgenthau wrote, when the Turkish authorities gave orders for these deportations, they were merely giving a death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal that fact, close quote. The Encyclopedia for the Armenian Genocide states, during the march, many Armenians were killed indiscriminately by Ottoman forces, which left a trail of corpses along the route of the march. To break the will of the marchers, the killings were performed with swords, resulting in great bloodshed. And as they continued the march, they were marched into the Syrian desert, where they died from starvation. At the Center of Holocaust and Human Rights and Genocide Education exhibit at Brookdale Community College, which my good friend and colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, knows so well as well, they have many remembrances of people in our state and elsewhere who were survivors. Well, one of those survivors put it this way, and I quote her, "Life was a matter of trying to survive. Every morning a cart would come around and take away the sick and the dead to be dumped into a common grave. They had taken my brother because he was a little sick. My crying and weeping were of no avail, especially because I was sick and petrified of being put on the cart." She was one of the lucky ones who survived. Let me remind my colleagues that the Genocide Convention of 1950, which the Turkish government has ratified, makes clear. Here's what the Genocide Convention says, and the Armenian genocide fits this to a T. The definition says this: genocide means any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of that group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. In the case of the Armenians, it wasn't in part, it was in whole. They wanted the Armenians eviscerated from the face of the earth. Let me just point out to my colleagues, despite Turkish government threats, and they do make threats, am I hearing the ambassador made threats in the year 2000? In fact, you remember that. It was outrageous. Well, 28 countries in 49 U.S. states, including my own state of New Jersey, have passed a law, resolution, or declaration recognizing the Armenian genocide. So again, I reserve the balance of my time, but I ask members to support this resolution. It's bipartisan, and it needs to be done.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the Majority Leader, the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Hoyer.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Without objection.
I thank the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, the chairman of the committee, for yielding. And I thank Mr. Smith for his career-long advocacy of human rights and protecting the most vulnerable, not only in this country, but throughout the world. Mr. Smith and I have had the opportunity to travel behind the Iron Curtain when it existed, talking about human rights, talking about the right to emigrate, the right to worship, the right to freedom of speech. Talked about the Helsinki Final Act. He and I were both members of the Helsinki Commission for a couple of decades together. He and I visited Turkey together, talking about particularly the freedom of the press and how many members, how many journalists were imprisoned. Mr. Smith and I, and Mr. Engel and I, and so many others, and certainly Mr. Schiff and others, have been supporters of this resolution for a very long time. It has not come to the floor. One of my duties as Majority Leader is to bring bills to the floor, and I am proud, along with the chairman and the ranking member, to bring this bill to the floor. This resolution, Mr. Speaker, recognizes the horrific and systematic efforts to commit genocide against the Armenian people a century ago. There can be no denial of the Armenian genocide, which is evidenced by historical documentation and the emotional scars still borne by the descendants of its survivors. It was a campaign of ethnic cleansing committed by the Ottoman Empire during and after the First World War, and it led to the deaths of 1.5 million Armenians, alongside other targeted groups. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Smith referenced Ambassador Morgenthau, who was our ambassador at this period of time. He said this: when the Turkish authorities gave the orders for these deportations, they were merely giving the death warrant to a whole race. They understood this well, and in their conversations with me, they made no particular attempt to conceal the fact. He went on to say that I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. Of course, we were tragically to see an even greater Holocaust in terms of numbers of lives lost in just some 30 years later. In addition, Mr. Speaker, the British ambassador to the United States in an October 1915 speech said this: the massacres are the result of a policy which, as far as I can ascertain, has been entertained for some considerable time. And I want to read this language. Considered for some considerable time by the gang of unscrupulous adventurers who are now in possession of the government of the Turkish Empire. They hesitated to put it in practice until they thought the favorable moment had come. And that moment seems to have arrived about the month of April. Now, the reason I bring that up is this resolution is not anti the present Turkish government. The sanctions bill will stand for that. This is about something that happened historically, that if not recognized, may well happen again. When you say never again, you must recognize what the never again is. I have talked to Turkish ambassadors and others for over a quarter of a century as a member of the Congress of the United States and said to them, this is not about your government. This is about, as the British ambassador says, a gang of thugs who took over your government over 100 years ago. I regret that our Turkish friends have not recognized this as our German friends have recognized their genocide and said this was wrong. Because if they tell their people this is wrong, it is more likely that it will not be repeated. Mr. Speaker, as the House joins in condemnation of that genocide and memorializes its victims, let us also keep our attention focused on populations today that are being subjected to ethnic cleansing and forced relocation. From the Rohingya to the Uyghurs, from the people in Darfur to the Kurdish population being forced from their homes in Syria, as we speak, we must declare loudly and clearly, never again. Never again. Sadly, never is now. In particular, our Kurdish allies who fought so courageously to help us defeat ISIS are being forced to leave their homes by Turkey's campaign to seize control of northern Syria. Let today's action in this House be a reminder, Mr. Speaker, to President Erdogan and his government. The United States is watching. The American people will not turn our eyes away. Neither will we turn our eyes away from the millions of others in Syria who have been displaced and the hundreds of thousands who have been killed, who have been bombed, gassed, and brutalized by the Assad regime and its enablers. That is why it's important to recognize the genocide perpetrated against the Armenian people, so that we will recognize other such actions which, because of their race or their color or their ethnicity or some other distinction, subject them to mass murder. Mr. Speaker, we need to let the American people's representatives give clear message to our Armenian brothers and sisters, to our Kurdish brothers and sisters. We see you. We will not abandon you. Never again. I yield back.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Mr.
Speaker,
Smith.
I just yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman's
I
recognized.
Thank my good friend and colleague, Mr. Hoyer, for his comments. We did travel so many times to the Soviet Union, the East Bloc countries, and to Turkey, and raised human rights issues methodically, persistently. But this issue has always been one of those unresolved, festering sores that if we could get it right, and this House going on record, I think, is the beginning of that process. So I want to thank him for his leadership over these years and his friendship, and above all, for that very eloquent statement. I reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to the author of this important resolution, the Vice Chair of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, Chair of the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of H.Res.296, which I introduced along with Representative Bill Rackus to recognize and commemorate the Armenian Genocide. This is a vote that I have fought for 19 years to cast. My wonderful colleagues, Anna Eshoo, Jackie Spear, have fought far longer than I have. It is one that tens of thousands of my constituents, my Armenian American constituents, have waited decades to see. It is a moment that so many have worked and struggled and prayed for, a moment when the House of Representatives refused to be enlisted in the cause of genocide denial. This April would have marked the 104th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide, the systematic murder of 1.5 million Armenians and the displacement of millions more by the Ottoman Empire from 1915 to 1923. Many other religious and ethnic minorities in the Ottoman Empire met similar fates, among them the Greeks, the Assyrians, the Chaldeans, and others. More than a century later, it is our solemn responsibility to remember those who were lost, to seek justice and restitution, and to educate Americans and those around the world about the crime of genocide. The facts of the genocide are horrific and undisputed by historians. They were recorded by American diplomats serving in the Ottoman Empire at the time, who bore witness in official cables to the annihilation of the Armenian population in the Ottoman Empire, a crime that at the time had no name. And though it lacked a name, there was no doubt in the observers of the time that they were witnessing a crime on a massive and industrial scale. The U.S. ambassador of the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, would recall later, "I am confident that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrific, horrible episode as this. The great massacres and persecutions of the past seem almost insignificant when compared with the suffering of the Armenian race in 1915. It was only decades later that Raphael Lemkin, a Holocaust survivor, coined the term genocide to describe the atrocities that had been visited upon the Jews as well as the Armenians. I have sat with survivors of the genocide, men and women, their numbers dwindling year after year, and heard them recall the destruction of their lives and the loss of all they had known. As children, they were forced from their homes and saw their families beaten, raped, and murdered. They fled across continents and oceans to build lives in this nation, in Armenia, and around the world. For them and for their descendants, the word genocide is sacred because it means that the world has not and will not forget. To deny genocide, on the other hand, is profane. It is, in the words of Elie Wiesel, a double killing. Mr. Speaker, it is always the right time to recognize genocide, but it is particularly so today. For when we see the images of terrified Kurdish families in northern Syria loading their possessions into cars or carts and fleeing their homes headed to nowhere except away from Turkish bombs and marauding militias, how can we truly say the crimes of a century ago are in the past? We cannot. We cannot pick and choose which crimes against humanity are convenient to speak about. We cannot cloak our support of human rights in euphemisms. We cannot be cowed into silence by a foreign power. But what we can do, what we must do, Mr. Speaker, is state the facts. We can say that the Ottoman Empire committed this grotesque crime against the Armenians. But their campaign of extermination failed. And above all, we will never forget and we will never again be silenced. I'm grateful, Mr. Engel, for your leadership, and that of Mr. McCall, and that of the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilrakis, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith. To so many members on both sides of the aisle who have fought for recognition for decades. I urge every member of the House to join today in supporting H.Res.296, and I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve the balance of our time.
Reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel.
I yield 3 minutes to an important leader on these issues for many, many years, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, first I would like to pay tribute to the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel, for helping to bring this to the floor, to everyone that is part of, from both sides of the aisle, of the Armenian caucus in the House, to my sister, friend, Congresswoman Jackie Speer, who shares this heritage with me. I rise in strong support of this resolution, House Resolution 296, which affirms the Armenian genocide. This is an historic day in the House of Representatives, and it's one that I've been waiting for 27 years. Between 1915 and 1923, 1.5 million Armenians and hundreds of thousands, and this is a historical fact that many people are not aware of, that there were hundreds of thousands of Assyrians, Greeks, Arameans, Maronites, and other Christians that were systematically slaughtered by the Ottoman Empire. This is deeply personal for me. I'm the only member of Congress of Armenian Assyrian descent and one of only 3 of with Armenian heritage in the House of Representatives, I think in the entire Congress, Senate and House. Some of you know that I had members of my own family that were among those that perished, and my parents fled with theirs to America. As my father said, the best idea that was ever born was America. What all of those that were persecuted had in common was that they were Christians, and that's why they were hunted down and slaughtered. This resolution not only honors my ancestors, but all those who perished in the first genocide of the 20th century. The United States has been missing in action on the honor roll of over 24 countries, 14 of which are NATO allies, and 49 states in our country that have formally recognized the Armenian genocide. And today, we can end over 100 years of silence by passing this resolution. Mr. Speaker, there's also an historic parallel as we are considering this resolution, and that is that Turkey is pursuing the ethnic cleansing of Kurds in Syria as we meet today. As Pope Francis declared when he visited the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan in 2016, memory should never be watered down or forgotten. Memory is the source of peace and the future. So today we remember, And we say to all those who perished, we remember, we love you, and we set an example for the young people of our country that the moral authority of the United States is well and alive. As we pass this resolution, I yield back.
Gentlewoman from California yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, I just want to thank Anna Eshoo for her, I yield myself 30 seconds for her leadership throughout many decades on this issue. It was her idea to bring it up on the floor today, and I want to thank her for that. Of course, she had to work within the leadership to get it done, but thank you for recommending that. And I want to remind members that in 2018, Anna Eshoo and I wrote the Iraq and Syria Genocide Relief and Accountability Act. It was signed by President Trump into law, and that provided two things: humanitarian relief for the tens of thousands of Christians and Yazidis fleeing from ISIS, and also it provided an accountability piece to collect for hopefully utilization in a future court cases against the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. So I want to thank her for that work that we did together, but again, for her leadership on this issue.
Gentleman reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Engel.
I yield 1 minute to the acting chairwoman of the Committee on Oversight and Reform, the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney.
Gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding and for his leadership on the committee and for this resolution, and to Anna Eshoo and Chairman Schiff and so many of my friends and colleagues for their long efforts to pass it on both sides of the aisle. As a member of the Congressional Caucus on Armenian Issues and the representative of a large and vibrant Armenian community in New York City, I strongly support H.R. 296, affirming the United States record on the Armenian genocide. 104 years ago, 1.5 million Armenians were murdered by the Ottoman Empire in the first genocide of the 20th century. Ever since, Armenian communities from across the world, including those in my district, have been forced to fight for recognition and justice, of denial in so many ways, from the illegal invasion of Cyprus by Turkey to the vicious attacks on Kurds within and without of the borders of Turkey. With our vote today, the United States takes a long overdue step to stop Turkey from hiding the truth of its actions. The Armenian genocide must be acknowledged by all, and in doing so, we can hope to prevent the next genocide. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman from New York yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve.
Reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I now yield 3 minutes to the co-chair of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spare.
Ms. Spare, the gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank the Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Engel, Chairman McCall, and to Mr. Smith, and a deep sense of gratitude to Congressman Schiff for introducing H.R. 296, and to my sister, my Armenian sister, Congresswoman Eshoo, for helping us plot this strategy to get this bill to the floor. April 24th, 1915, is a day that lives in infamy in the hearts and minds of millions of Armenians worldwide. It's a day that I grew up understanding from my Armenian mother to be one of the darkest in history. It's the day that the Ottoman government embarked on a systematic slaughter of 1.5 million Armenians, 2/3 of the Armenian population. This genocide is recognized in countries around the world, including Canada, France, and Germany. It's recognized in 49 states in our union as the first genocide of the 20th century. Yet the House of Representatives hasn't recognized both the genocide occurred and that the Ottoman Empire perpetrated it. Elie Wiesel called it denying genocide, and in particular the Armenian genocide, a double killing, because it not only exterminates a group of people, it murders the memory of that crime. Congress must ensure that memory is not destroyed and those lives are honored. As a child, I listened to my mom speak of the atrocity with pain and fear. She is gone now, but her pain lives on in me to this very day. By righting this terrible wrong, one that has festered for far too long, we are alleviating that pain and sending a message that history can't be rewritten. We are stating in no uncertain terms that America will no longer abandon Armenians with feeble excuses made for a so-called ally. We are affirming that truth is truth. Thousands of documents totaling 37,000 pages in the National Archives supports the truth. Armenians were exterminated by Ottoman forces and Turkish sympathizers. In 1918, former President Theodore Roosevelt sent a letter saying, quote, "Because the Armenian massacre was the greatest crime of the war, failure to act against Turkey is to condone it and means that all talk of guaranteeing future peace is nonsense," unquote. Usually these words serve as a general warning, but today they apply to specific ongoing atrocities. We must not stand silent as Turkey attempts the ethnic cleansing of the Kurds in Syria. Even Russia's President Putin had said, quote, "The Armenian people went through one of the greatest tragedies in human history." Iran's former vice president stated the Ottoman Turkey government perpetrated genocide in 1950. If our rivals can talk about this, if they can take a stand, certainly we can. Armenian genocide, we must say it is here, it happened, it will never happen again. We must make that commitment. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. From California, gentleman from New York is reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Speaker, I yield such time as you may consume to the gentleman from Florida, Congressman Bilirakis.
Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Co-sponsor of the resolution.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's been more than 100 years since the atrocities committed against innocent Armenians and other ethnic and religious minorities at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire genocidal campaign from 1915 to 1923 killed 1.5 million Armenians, men and women and children, as well as Greeks, Assyrians, Chaldeans, and Syriacs throughout a series of executions and death marches. Finally, today we are entering into the United States record the Armenian genocide and the historical fact. Today we end a century of international silence. There will not be another period of indifference or international ignorance to the lives lost to systematic murder. Genocides, wherever and whenever they occur, cannot be ignored, whether they took place in the 20th century by the Ottoman Turks or mid-20th century by the Third Reich and in Darfur. Genocide must be acknowledged for what it is, a scourge on the human race. Genocide is genocide, Mr. Speaker, even if our so-called strategic allies perpetrate it. President Ronald Reagan explicitly referred to the Ottoman Empire's actions as the genocide of the Armenians in a 1981 Holocaust Remembrance Day speech. And over 30 nations have formally recognized the genocide, including France, Germany, and even Russia. Today, Mr. Speaker, the United States is going to acknowledge it as well. I found Pope Francis's words and explicit use of the term genocide to be another wake-up call for the world. We must acknowledge the atrocities of the past so that we might hopefully prevent them in the future. Our darkest moments as a human race have come during times when those who knew better stood silently, making excuses for passivity and allowing injustice and persecution to reign. Turkey's current actions in northern Syria against our Kurdish allies is extremely concerning, and we must we cannot stand by and let egregious human rights violations happen. Turkey's offensive into Syria is unacceptable behavior from a U.S. ally and so-called secular democracy, as well as a NATO member. It's simply deplorable, Mr. Speaker. We also need to make sure that other genocidal campaigns being waged in the Middle East are also properly recognized. ISIS is a perpetrator of genocide. Christians and other minorities are being killed solely because of their religion, and no modern society should sit silently in the face of such barbaric brutality. Again, I'm thankful we are finally recognizing these atrocities and these acts against the Armenian people. Like the earliest Christians, the Armenians proved themselves not only survivors of persecution, but also masters of their destinies. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Florida yields back the balance of his time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nonproliferation on our Foreign Affairs Committee. He's been a leader on this issue for years. The gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, 2 minutes.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, is recognized for 2 minutes.
American honor demands that we end our complicity in genocide denial. 4 arguments are made against this resolution. The first is that it's not true. No one can even make that argument anymore. 1.5 million Armenians and countless Assyrians, Greeks, and others massacred by the Ottoman government. Second, they argue that Turkey's such a great ally that we should turn a blind eye to what happened last century. Earlier this month, Turkish forces shelled both to the left and the right of American military bases. American soldiers fled in unseemly haste. Great ally Turkey is. Then we're told, well, the Foreign Affairs Committee hasn't had hearings. We've had countless hearings on this for decades, including also a 4-hour markup where we passed it through the committee. And the only argument made on the other side there was Turkey was such a great ally. Well, last week we had hearings in our committee that demonstrate that Turkey is not such a great ally of the United States. And finally, we're told, and this was insulting, I think, during the rules debate, someone arguing against the rules said it's not worth our time. 1.5 million dead. The fact is that genocide denial is the last act of a genocide. First you obliterate a people, then you obliterate their memory, and finally you seek to obliterate the memory of the obliteration. And also, genocide denial is the first step in the next genocide. When Hitler's cadres wondered whether they could get away with the Holocaust, he was able to reassure them by saying, "Who today speaks of the annihilation of the Armenians?" Denying genocide in the past will lead to more genocides in the future. Today, Germany is a great and prosperous democracy because it has come to grips with its own past. Where would Germany be today if it denied the Holocaust? Turkey will become a prosperous and a modern nation only when it recognizes the first genocide of the 20th century. The best thing we could do for Turkey is to acknowledge the genocide and urge them to do likewise. I yield back.
I could yield an additional minute to my colleague.
Gentleman.
You asked for a minute.
I thank the gentleman from...
Time right now. Gentleman from New York, you yield any time or his time has expired?
I reserve.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman asked me
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized, and gentleman from New Jersey
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
yields 1 minute,
and a half
to the gentleman. Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, has 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding, and this is indeed a bipartisan speech. The fact is, many other countries have recognized this genocide, and they've done so under tremendous Turkish pressure. For example, France was told that they would not be able to export to Turkey if they recognize the genocide. They did, and in the subsequent 6 years, French exports to Turkey quadrupled. This genocide has been recognized by Argentina, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the list goes on and on. It is time for America to also recognize the truth. And so I look forward to the day, which is not true today, when scholars and individuals in Turkey can talk about the genocide, can come to grips with their own past, instead of being threatened with incarceration for even mentioning this debate. Because Turkey will not have the rule of law and democracy until you're free to discuss the first genocide of the 20th century on Turkish soil. I yield back.
Jim yields back balance of time. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves.
Mr. Speaker, we reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to a valued member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline.
Gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chair, I rise in support of H.Res.296, a resolution introduced by my friend Mr. Schiff to recognize the horror of the genocide perpetuated against the Armenian people by the Ottoman Empire between 1913 and 1925, killing 1.5 million martyrs. There is no question that the Ottoman Empire carried out a systemic campaign of persecution, forced removal, starvation, and murder against Armenians, along with other Christian minorities living under Ottoman rule. This campaign was documented in real time by American diplomats and has been acknowledged in various forms by previous administrations and Congresses, the last in 1984. In order to prevent future genocides and mass atrocities, it's vital that we never forget those who have already occurred. For too long, we've allowed foreign interests to lobby the United States in favor of turning the other way and not wholly recognizing the truth of the Armenian genocide. That ends today. In Rhode Island, we have a very proud Armenian community that have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. They deserve for Congress to acknowledge the history of their people and the truth of the Armenian genocide. That will happen today. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back balance of time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, another wonderful member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Costa.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Costa, is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Chairman, I'm proud to support House Resolution 296, which would establish the permanent United States recognition and the ongoing remembrance of the Armenian genocide. And I want to thank Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall and Mr. Smith, and all of the supporters of this resolution. In 1915, the Ottoman Empire, as we all know, embarked upon a systematic deportation and murder of 1.5 million Armenians. These innocent men and women and children became the first genocide, as we know, in the 20th century. Many of these survivors settled in my district in the San Joaquin Valley, where they lived, and their children have enjoyed the blessings of liberty and lived the American dream. This incredible, diverse valley that I have the honor to represent, we sometimes refer to as the land of William Saroyan. The land of William Saroyan, noted Armenian author. And Fresno State University is the only university in the United States that has a memorial dedicated to the Armenian genocide, a very moving memorial to their ancestors. Yet this brutal atrocity has not received the official recognition it deserves. So today it is proper and fitting that we do so. This is a moral issue. I call upon my colleagues to join me and more than 110 co-sponsors in supporting this long overdue passage by the United States House of Representatives. Mr. Speaker, the horrors of the Armenian genocide can never, ever, ever be undone. Yet by acknowledging the suffering of these victims through the official recognition of the Armenian genocide, we can ensure that at least future generations will never forget. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, another respected member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Liu.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Engel and Congressman Smith, for your leadership. The United States of America should never be afraid to tell the truth, and yet for too long, we did not recognize the Armenian genocide. That ends today. The House of Representatives is going to formally recognize the Armenian genocide. Over a century ago, the Ottoman Empire began a plan to systematically exterminate Armenians from their land. 1.5 million Armenians were killed across the Turkish countryside. No amount of revisionist history or lobbying can change those facts. Today is a historic day. Today, we tell the truth and we honor the Armenian genocide. I yield back.
Gentleman of California yields back of his time. Gentleman from New York reserves his time. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Speaker, we reserve.
No. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith, reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
It's now my honor to yield 1 minute to our Speaker of the House, the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
Gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, more importantly, I thank him for bringing this very important legislation to the floor today. And thank you, Mr. Smith, for your ongoing commitment to justice in the world in terms of respecting the dignity and worth of people and not ignoring atrocities when they happen now and long time ago. It's a pleasure to work with you always. And Mr. Chairman, again, I thank you. We have tried and gotten this bill out of committee more than one time, and now it has come to the floor. It's an honor to speak on it, and it's a great day for the Congress that we have that privilege. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Smith. Mr. Speaker, I rise to join my colleagues in solemn remembrance of one of the great atrocities of the 20th century, the systematic murder of more than 1.5 million Armenian men, women, and children by the Ottoman Empire. Too often, tragically, the truth of this staggering crime has been denied. Today, let us clearly state the facts on the floor of this House to be etched forever into the congressional record. The barbarism committed against the Armenian people was a genocide. As international observers wrote at the time, it was a campaign of race extermination, one that we as members of Congress and as freedom-loving people have a moral obligation to never forget. If we ignore history, then we are destined to witness the mistakes of the past be repeated. The recent attacks by the Turkish military against the Kurdish people are a stark and brutal reminder of the danger in our own time. That is why it is critical year in and year out to reaffirm our dedication to recognizing the Armenian genocide and to placing the U.S. Congress firmly on the side of honesty in our histories and for that, I thank Chairman Schiff, Chairman Engel, Congresswoman Eshoo, Armenian co-chairs Pallone and Spear, and all who have worked relentlessly on this critical resolution, which states that Democrats and Republicans join to commemorate the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance, to reject efforts to enlist, engage, or otherwise associate the United States government with denial of the Armenian genocide or any other genocide, and third, encourage education and public understanding of the facts of the Armenian genocide, including the United States' role in humanitarian relief efforts and the relevance of the Armenian genocide to modern-day crimes against humanity. To honor the memory of those lost and the suffering of those who survived, we firmly and unequivocally denounce all attempts to devalue or minimize these heinous crimes. I urge a strong vote for this resolution, which is a statement of America's commitment to human rights and to the truth. We are blessed in our country with a large Armenian American population, some serving, Congresswoman Spear, Congresswoman Eshoo, and others in this House. And every year we come together to observe the sadness of the genocide. But today, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Smith, today, we have the opportunity, and may we have the strength and courage to always denounce hate, violence, and bigotry, to right the wrongs of history, and to build a future of hope, peace, and freedom for all mankind. That is who we are as Americans. Thank you. Mr. Chairman and others for giving us the opportunity to state our values. Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
Chairwoman of California yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
We reserve.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves the balance of his time. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
I yield 2 minutes to the co-chair of the Congressional Armenian Caucus, the gentleman from New Jersey, who has for many, many years been at the forefront of championing this very important resolution. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and let me thank Mr. Engel for all his work on this. And I have to, of course, thank all the members of the Armenian Caucus. One of the reasons that we founded the Armenian Caucus was the recognition of the Armenian genocide. But I also have to mention that, as I think everyone knows, without Speaker Pelosi, this would never have come to the floor today. It's ultimately her decision to bring it to the floor, and I just want to thank her immensely. Official recognition of the Armenian genocide is a powerful reminder that we will not turn away when we know full well that crimes against humanity have been perpetrated. We stand here today to pay tribute to the victims of this horrific chapter of history, to the perseverance of those who survived, and to the Americans of Armenian descent who continue to strengthen our country. It's our duty to honor that history with an honest, factual statement recognizing the massacre of 1.5 million Armenians as the 20th century's first genocide. This resolution cannot undo the horrors of the victims endured or the pain that their descendants carry with them, but we have an obligation to speak candidly about the past that is directly tied to our moral responsibilities of the present. The United States must never accept crimes against humanity, and we must do everything in our power to prevent and stop atrocities unfolding in real time. What is currently taking place in Syria, the killing of the Kurds at the hands of the Turkish President Erdogan, is unacceptable. And it is far past time for the Turkish government to accept its responsibility for systematic extermination of Armenians in the past century and to commit to protect the dignity of every human life in this century. I encourage my colleagues to join in supporting this long overdue recognition of the Armenian genocide. Your vote is not only for the Armenians, but to prevent genocide in the future. And let us note that the Ottoman Turks did not succeed. The Armenians are still here in the United States, in the Republic of Armenia, in Artsakh, and the American people and their representatives will continue to be with you. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to yield 1 minute to a gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. Today, the House of Representatives will affirm, finally, that we recognize the horrors of the Armenian genocide and are committed to remembering the victims of this crime against humanity. Our moral standing in the world requires us to acknowledge the truth of the Armenian genocide. For too long, we have acquiesced in Turkey's policy of genocide denial, unwilling to risk the ire of our so-called ally. However, Turkey's actions against the Kurds in Syria have reinforced what many of us have long known. Erdogan's Turkey does not stand for human rights or religious freedom, but instead spreads authoritarianism wherever it goes. Erdogan's disdain for democracy and contempt for an ally were on display 2 years ago when his bodyguards attacked peaceful demonstrators right here in our nation's capital. I'm pleased that later today the House will vote to impose sanctions on Turkey for its actions in Syria. This resolution and that bill are tied together. They are both powerful statements that we respect fundamental human rights and we desire to stand on the right side of history. I yield back.
Gentleman's time from Maryland has expired. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to a gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence.
Gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, is recognized.
Today, finally,
a congressional recognition will pay tribute to the Armenian, the Assyrian, the Greek, the Chaldean, and other lives lost, the determination of those who survive, and to many Americans of the Armenian descent who continue to strengthen our country today. We honor those contributions with an honest statement of history, recognizing the massacre of 1.5 Armenians as the 20th century first genocide. In the spirit of honoring these victims, I'm proud to co-sponsor House Resolution 296, an official recognition of the Armenian genocide. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now my pleasure to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I acknowledge Mr. Schiff and my dear friend Nana Eshoo and all of those, Mr. Pallone, and all of the members who have stood tall and strong, Mr. Smith and Mr. Engel, for this very important statement. Let me, as a member of the Armenian caucus, indicate that I rise with a heavy heart, but I rise with an appreciation and an excitement that we have come to this point. It is important to acknowledge that the United States, as this was occurring, the United States record on the Armenian genocide goes back to more than a century, in fact, to July 16, 1915, when Henry Morgenthau, United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire from 1913 to 1916, organized and led protests by officials of many countries against what he described as the empire's campaign for race extermination. It was instructed on July 16, 1915 by United States Secretary of State Robert Lansing that the department approves your procedure to stop Armenian persecution. I rise in support of finally having this nation take this stand. Bloodshed, genocide should not be tolerated, no matter how long we have come to that. And so I stand with the words that we now therefore will commemorate as the United States of America the Armenian genocide through official recognition and remembrance. We will reject efforts to enlist, engage, or otherwise associate the United States government with a denial of the Armenian genocide or any other genocide. My friends, I went to the Sudanese.
Expired.
Do I have 30 seconds?
Yes, I yield the gentlewoman an additional 30 seconds.
Gentlewoman is recognized for an additional 30 seconds.
I'm reminded of the time, both Mr. Engel and Mr. Smith, that we traveled to the Sudanese embassy to protest the genocide in Darfur. We can do no less. It is not just 10 years ago. It's more than 100 years ago, at least, that we saw this genocide. There's no embassy that maybe will arrest us now. But I say to Turkey that it is finally time for you to acknowledge this genocide. And tragically, you have restarted and reignited the dastardly act of genocide acts against the Kurds. I am glad today, on this day, that we are acknowledging that one genocide can be no worse than another genocide. Silence on one genocide is silence on all genocides. And I stand here today to support H.Res.296 to acknowledge the Armenian genocide by the United States of America. I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
My understanding that there's no further speakers other than the chairman. Yes. Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to close, if I could.
Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith,
I yield
is
myself
recognized.
as time as I may consume. As I mentioned earlier, the Encyclopedia of the Armenian Genocide states, during the march, many Armenians were killed indiscriminately by the Ottoman forces, which left a trail of corpses along the route of the march. To break the will of the marchers, they used swords, resulting in great bloodshed. Marchers who survived these attacks faced starvation, as no provisions whatsoever were made. Many elderly and infirm marchers died in this way during the march. The significantly reduced numbers of marchers who finally made it into the Syrian desert were put into concentration camps and then released into the scalding desert with no food, water, and to a certain death. Mr. Speaker, despite having ratified the Genocide Convention back in 1950, the Turkish government has waged an amazingly deceitful campaign of denial and has done so over the course of decades using a variety of means to bully and intimidate and punish Turkish citizens who dare to acknowledge the genocide committed by the Ottoman government beginning in 1915. Ankara also seeks to intimidate nations. Many nations have refused to be intimidated and to be bullied. Poland, Germany, the Holy See, Italy, Russia, France, Holland, Portugal, the Czech Republic, Denmark, Paraguay, Bolivia, Brazil, Austria, Bulgaria, the European Parliament, Luxembourg, Sweden, Chile, Argentina, Lithuania, Venezuela, Slovakia, Canada, Uruguay, Switzerland, Lebanon, Belgium, Greece, Cyprus, all have come out strongly and stated and acknowledged the Armenian genocide. We need to do the same today. Over the years, several U.S. presidents have acknowledged the cruelty and the carnage, but it was Ronald Reagan who called it an Armenian genocide. He said, like the genocide of the Armenians before it and the genocide of the Cambodians which followed it, and like too many other persecutions of too many peoples, the lessons of the Holocaust must never be forgotten. To be sure, President Carter, Bush, Clinton, Bush, they said strong words. They had strong words to describe it. President Bush called it forced exile and the annihilation of 1.5 million Armenians. President Obama had promised to recognize the genocide, but didn't. A Los Angeles Times story on April 21st, 2015 said it all. Armenian hopes crushed as Obama decides not to use the word genocide. It does matter, Mr. Speaker. Genocide is a very precise term. It has real meaning in international law because of the Genocide Convention, and all presidents, members of Congress, I hope, will stand up and say that word. Let me remind my colleagues, because it is referenced again in the resolution, that back in 1984, we passed a joint resolution to designate April 24th, 1985. It didn't pass in the Senate, but it did pass here. And it said, in part, that April 24th, 1985 is designated as National Day of Remembrance of Man's Inhumanity to Man, and authorized the President to observe the day of remembrance for all the victims of genocide, and listen up, especially for the 1.5 million people of Armenian ancestry who were the victims of genocide perpetrated in Turkey between 1915 and 1923. So I say to my colleagues who are watching, we've gone on record before. Let's not be intimidated by Turkey and Erdogan and others. I would like to say a special thanks to the tenacious leaders of the Armenian National Committee of America and the Armenian Assembly and the Armenian diaspora for persistently encouraging Congress to step up and pass this kind of resolution. After a century of denial, obfuscation, and lies by Turkey, it's time to affirm and reiterate the truth of the Armenian genocide and honor the victims, the survivors, and their families. Yield back the balance of our time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of time. Gentleman from New York is recognized. Mr. Engel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I claim as much time as I may consume for the purpose of closing. The resolution before us is an important measure for Congress to set the record straight, to call out the atrocities suffered by the Armenian people at the hands of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century as a genocide. I again want to thank the author of this measure, Mr. Schiff, along with the many champions for the Armenian people in the House. And I want to congratulate the Armenian American community, which has worked for so many years to try to get this resolution to the House floor and then get it passed. We are really making history today, and I thank my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, Mr. Smith and all the others who spoke. I think this is very important, and I think we will be sending a very, very strong message all around the world. So I urge my colleagues to vote yes on this important resolution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 655, the previous question is ordered on the resolution and the preamble. The question is on the adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. And the ayes have it. The resolution is agreed to, and without objection, the motion reconsidered is laid on
Speaker,
the
on that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number have risen. The yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the unfinished business is the vote on adoption of House Resolution 296, on which the yeas and nays are ordered. The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 296, resolution affirming the United States record on the Armenian Genocide.
The question is on adoption of the resolution. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
The House wrapping up debate on several suspension bills, but spending the bulk of their day on two issues. And those will both get votes in this series of 3 votes on the House floor. This first one is 15 minutes, and it's a bill that affirms the policy of the United States to commemorate the Armenian Genocide through official recognition and remembrance. Again, a 15-minute vote. They'll follow that with the other bill that's been the focus of the day from the House Foreign Affairs Committee, a bipartisan measure sanctioning Turkish officials involved in the Syria operation and banks involved in the defense sector until Turkey ends its military operations in Syria. That will come up next. That is a 5-minute vote, and one more 5-minute vote will follow. Later in the week, on Thursday, the House will take up a resolution dealing with the procedure on impeachment. The Rules Committee tomorrow will take up that resolution, formalizing those procedures for the next phase of the impeachment inquiry into President Trump. We'll cover that Rules meeting tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. Also, the measure is expected to get a floor vote here in the House sometime early on Thursday. And, of course, all of that coverage will be here on C-SPAN. 15-minute vote. Again, the measure they're voting on now is affirming the policy of the U.S., commemorating the Armenian Genocide through official recognition and remembrance.
you.